about 3/4, so 73% of people actually leave their job because they don't like the company culture.
Hey, if you build a great culture, you're going to do well as a company. That problem is that the things get measured, which I'm a big believer in, measuring things, but the things that get measured get managed. And people are not measuring culture or engagement or happiness, or rarely, or do they do a very good job at it.
Welcome to episode 11 of This is the Way with Arten and Michael. We're here to share our experience, insights, and knowledge around career growth, side hustles, and startups, and hopefully, pave the way for you on your journey. Today, we wanted to focus on workplace culture.
Dun, dun, dun.
Dun, dun. Yes. Workplace culture, obviously, it's a big topic. We're looking it up, and there's actually some surveys out there. Robert Walters Group, they did a study that showed about 3/4, so 73% of people actually leave their job because they don't like the company culture. And there was another study that we found that showed 82% of professionals had worked for a company where they dislike the company culture. So culture is obviously a very, very big thing on people's mind when considering a role or thinking about leaving a role.
You mentioned 82%, but there's another angle of that too that was also interesting, which is while 82% of professionals have worked for a company where they dislike the company culture, 90% of employers recognize the importance of finding candidates who are a good fit for the culture in the organization, meaning there's this huge disconnect that's happening there because while one's saying it's super important and this is how we're going to get the people we need in here, they're doing a horrible, job at it. Or by they, we. I mean, when you look at companies in general, so many people understand the importance of this, but they are still not succeeding in making company cultures that people are actually excited to wake up on a Monday morning and go in and be like, let's do this.
Why do you think that? Why do you think companies struggle with workplace culture? I mean, we've obviously experienced pretty famous cultures, and we saw how things were at Disney and Netflix, and our own ventures kind of wanted to create our own cultures. But why do you think most companies struggle with culture?
I think it generally comes down to a couple of core things. Probably the one that's the biggest driver of it is that what gets rewarded usually relates to the bottom line. And while everybody agree, meaning, the financials, what a company needs to achieve is around its goals. And even though everybody acknowledges that, hey, if you build a great culture, then you're going to do well as a company. That problem is that the things get measured, which I'm a big believer in, measuring things, but the things that get measured get managed. And people are not measuring culture or engagement or happiness, or rarely, or do they do a very good job at it? It's usually one of those passive things where they realize because a few people have recently quit, and then all of a sudden they start talking to HR and be like, well, what's going on here? Do we have an issue? It's like, well, yeah, you've had an issue for a while, and now you're just seeing the results of not addressing it for a long time because instead all of the meetings are around whether or not somebody hit, again, the financial goals or something like that. So I think if leaders are actually held accountable and the things that are getting measured are around culture, then I think it might look different. But every company, even though they know it's important, still fall back to, did we hit our quarterly goals related to financial performance? That's, I think, the key driver.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting too, when you talk about measuring culture, it feels like the default is always, as soon as shit hits the fan, let's do a survey. As if that passive approach of a survey is all of a sudden going to turn around a culture. I think the other reason why I believe companies, or even if you want to dissect the company and say organizations or departments struggle with culture, is I think it has to be top down. I think the leader of that company, that organization, that department has to truly believe that culture is extremely important. And if they don't buy into that they don't believe that, now it's just fluff and smoke and mirrors. That they'll do things to look good, but they're not actually following through with a lot of action. And so much of culture is people are looking at the leader as kind of a model. So when they don't see the leader actually talking the talk, and walking, it just, people start not trusting what's being put out as this is our culture, company culture, mission, and values.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think if you look at some companies that are renowned for their culture a bit more, and two examples: Netflix. Another one would be Bridgewater, Ray Dalio's company, and obviously another one would have been, when you think about Zappos. I'm not sure exactly today, but when is it Tony Hsieh? Is that how you say his last name? Was leading the company. Like, those are all these examples, but that was a key priority to him, and the leaders lived it. And I just use an example from Netflix there. It's like, when I got hired at Netflix, well, part of that at the time was I ended up having dinner amongst 4 others at Reed Hastings' home. And like, that was pretty incredible. But what did we do? We talked culture. That was a key piece of it. And it's so important for him, and the way that he and he had different leaders with culture throughout. In fact, I think Patty, I'm trying to remember Patty's last name, who was, one of the original sort of builders of Netflix culture with him. But in that scenario, like, they lived and breathed it. And Ray Dalio, you hear about him and how he talks about it. And therefore, I think then they are holding these leaders accountable to it. But then what happens there too is then those leaders, as you get down, because a bigger company, the more you start creating these subcultures, because the leader might say, here's what we're going to do. But if he doesn't have the right people on the ground who are ensuring that they follow through with that, and if the right incentives aren't there, and instead they're getting their bonus because of the performance of, the company, and not the performance of, or not, I shouldn't say the company, the financials versus the team, ends up with leaders who are incentivized the wrong way, or leaders who were hired or promoted into the role in the first place that weren't the right fit to be able to drive the culture. They may have been really great with the numbers, but that doesn't mean that they were the right fit to drive the culture forward.
Yeah. A little bit of a trick question. So you mentioned Netflix, Zappos, and then Ray Dalio's company.
Yeah.
What's the common denominator between those 3?
Well, the one I was pointing out initially, but maybe there's something more you're thinking about, was the leaders lived and breathed it. But maybe there's something else that you're leaning into here.
Yeah. So what I've seen, and the point I'm trying to make, is those 3 examples, they are the founding CEOs of their companies. And what I see usually happen is, as the company gets further removed from the founding CEO and founding leadership, it just feels like culture gets eroded, and you need a more like laser focus on culture to keep it at a certain level. Let's use Disney as an example, because we're both very familiar with it. Being several CEOs removed from Walt Disney himself, sure, there is a high level cultural value that Disney publishes, but there are so many subcultures within Disney, and every little team has its own, because it's not really top down. It's just left at a very high level, and everybody is kind of doing their own thing when it comes to culture. And that's where it gets more difficult to actually rein things back, to get back to that holistic cultural value that maybe Walt Disney had back in the days.
I think it's a great point. I think sometimes too, there's this challenge that leaders have in, like, that company is built so much around how that person lived and breathed. I mean, we'll take Disney as an example. It's like Iger, or Eisner or anybody else wasn't, Disney. They may have tried to lean into some of the sensibilities there, but they weren't. They were never going to be. There's few Disneys, in the world, just like there's few Steve Jobs in the world. And, I think what ends up happening though is that there is this hesitation sometimes for leaders who take over for a company to 100% make it theirs, because you can't. I mean, you could, but you're trying to respect the legacy that was built before you. And I think that could pose a bit of a challenge. That said, and maybe this is something we need to figure out and look at some other, examples out there. But like, I'll just use this. This might sound smaller, but I had just visited this company recently as I look at acquiring a home services business. And it's a company out of Colorado. They're called High Five, and they're a plumbing company. And in that case, that person, again, you could see that the culture and everything was literally built around this person, living and breathing. And I was there with another individual at the time who had just bought a company, and they're like, well, maybe I should adopt some of those principles. And one of the things that, kind of one of the individuals there who has success in the space said is, don't just try to adopt somebody else's culture. It has to be you. And I think that adds that challenge is if people are trying to just adopt what they see elsewhere, but they don't really live and breathe it, you end up with that disconnect as well. But I have a question for you I want to ask actually too, because you had helped when Disney acquired Fox. You played a key role there in some of those integration. And this is where a lot of companies actually end up struggling sometimes is when they buy another company. The hardest part and the reason some of these deals fail is because the difference in cultures. And now when Disney bought Pixar, they purposely tried to leave that culture alone. And then they tried to actually take some of the learnings from that culture so that Disney animation could then be its own, not a Pixar, but how can it still grow to be its own thing? And I think this is something that we can then look at and say, all right, well, within Disney, I don't want to say that that breaks, the rules that, you're saying about it needing to be a founder. But what did end up happening over there is they did start to carve out and create what their own culture was. And it was a subculture within Disney. And I think that was successful. But getting back to my question for you, when you were working on the Fox acquisition, what were your observations there? And, were there key learnings or around culture or any advice that you'd have for others who are looking at similar large integrations?
When I was initially asked to kind of help lead or be one of the leaders of integrating the studio operations of both organizations, I quickly started finding books on the topic, mergers and acquisitions, and doing a bunch of research online around best practices and, how do you do this? That one of the common, anywhere I read, even books, YouTube videos, online, the common denominator was that most acquisitions or mergers fail because of culture. And the percentage was actually very high, more than 50%. So when finally the deal was closed and legally you were allowed to start getting in there and figuring out how to do this, I made it a point that, number one, I wanted to understand what their culture was like and try to assimilate myself into their culture. And then at the same time, how do I just within my own little culture, with my own personality, how do I infuse them with who I am? And that, we can definitely bring on some of the folks on this podcast and ask them their opinion. I think it went well because as a lot of people were having struggles working with some of the incoming new Disney team members, I built great relationship very easily with some of the senior leadership at 20th Century Fox, which made it easy to understand what they do and then try to come up with what should we do collectively. And I think it all goes back to trust. One of the core cultural attributes is trust. Like if people don't trust each other around the workplace, there is no culture. Everybody's going to be backstabbing each other. Everybody's going to be maneuvering and, trying to be whatever their agenda is. But if there's trust, that's the foundation of trying to build a culture. And that was my focus during that acquisition integration.
So then I have another question for you, going back to something else I just touched on a second ago around there, because you were saying that what those other companies had in common was, again, their original founder. And that's why I did want to point out the, feature animation, even though they're part of, Disney. And I'm sure there's ample other companies that we just aren't as familiar with, or scenarios such as, Tim Cook, who's continued over at Apple. And again, it may not be the Steve Jobs, but it doesn't mean the company still isn't, respected on that culture front. And again, every time you say that, and I know it's, there's some people who will be like, yeah, I love it. And there's other people who will be like, I hate it. And that's going to happen in any company. But as we do think about this, and as we look at trying to provide some advice or tips on how to do it, because you can even be in a company that's not the best on culture, but you can still create subcultures and you can still, as a leader, operate whether you were that founder or not. I think if you come in it with that mentality, I believe, of a level of servant leadership, how you're looking after the team. But what would be some of the key advice or tips that you would have? What do you think has worked well in companies that establish or grow thriving cultures?
I'll go back to say leadership. It has to start there. So you and I know we kind of drink the culture Kool-Aid. We think it's important. So we put a lot of emphasis on it. And it showed in our team and the way they were and how people looked at our teams as, wow, that's a pretty interesting thing going on there. So number one, it has to be top down. If that leader doesn't care for it, then forget it. No matter how many team building activities and posters you create and how many versions and iterations of your mission statement you write, none of it is going to matter.
So I want to touch on something else real quick around leadership that I think is really important. And it's a place where I think a lot of leaders end up failing, is that define clear set of values, a clear vision, and expectation back to employees. Because I know for me, when I've been in organizations where the leader lacked a vision, it was hard for me to get excited and go along. Don't get me wrong. I could create things for my own team and do so, but you want to tie those ultimately. And in a well-run company, you could see how that ties all the way back up to the company's goals and visions. If it's still, too separate from the rest of the company, it's just hard for people to connect and understand how they're adding value. But at the same time, on the note of values, it's different kind of values. People in a company, it should be established, what is okay, what is not okay, what are the things that we're striving for. And I think that's another super important thing. So being a leader who is a good leader of people is about making sure that there's clarity around the vision and how each individual can contribute to achieve that.
Yeah. The other thing I would add is when you're building your culture as a leader, try to be as close as possible to your personality, because it makes it easier. Like if I wanted to build a culture and called it a place of, music and, anything that musicality, well, that's not me. I don't play any instrument. Like it'll be very hard for me to infuse that into the culture. I could say it. I'm like, yeah, this place is going to feel like a concert. Well, not exactly, but I'm a sports guy. I know sports. I take a lot of influence from coaches and athletes. So it was very easy for me to build a culture around, let's be the best team that we could be and mirror a professional team. And how do we achieve that? And, my personality definitely infused a lot of how that worked because it became natural. I wasn't like trying hard. It was very easy because it was my personality. And I think that just makes it easy. If you care about culture, bring it close to your personality, execution of it becomes much easier.
Absolutely agree. And a little plumbing company, and I say little in terms of, it's under 50 employees, but I think it's important because no matter if you're a company that's a Fortune 500 company, Disney that's got over 100,000 employees, or whether or not you're the small company, it still comes down to, again, that passion of the leadership and, again, a set, clear way of how we operate. And the small companies, and what's really interesting is they take people on a tour. It's unlike most, plumbing places, and that's why it stood out and was so unique. And we took a tour of it. But they will literally, you'll come in and you'll actually see the team members and stuff in there. They do vision boards, man. And they of course then also have like their numbers and metrics up on the wall they need to achieve. But whenever people hit a goal, it's like you get to throw a dart over here, to get a bonus around it. The concept of them being called high five, they literally will give their customers at the end of the thing, like a high five, and they get the picture with that. They are very much engaged with the community and charity. In fact, each month they go and try to support these different charities and stuff. And like all of that is embodied from the leader. But what's also incredible about it is what it allows for is when they bring people through on that tour, there's a lot of people who say, this is my place. And about half of the people say, no way, Jose. Like they don't like that. It's not for them. And I think that's so important for people to find the culture that, is the right match for them. But a huge benefit that this company has to do in that is they actually, because of the right things that they have in place, they rarely make a bad or incorrect hire. And if they do, that person is usually the first one to say, hey, I realize this probably wasn't the best fit. But because they go through that tour and because of the way they set that up, that sort of interview process becomes a really good way for the person and the company to date each other better than I think what comes out of a lot of interviews. Because when most people are in interviews, Netflix being a big exception, which I could talk about more in a minute, but you don't usually in the 30 minutes or 1 hour or whatever it is, you don't really get a good sense of each other. And both individuals, the company and the person, feel like they're kind of just telling the other one what they want to hear. So I think that's where something like that can be so incredible, of how you can incorporate thinking about that, because it matters so much to the type of people you're going to attract.
Yeah. I mean, let's touch on that hiring, because that's such a critical aspect of maintaining your culture, because you want to hire into it people that actually fit and believe in it. And obviously, Netflix being very famous for their culture and their hiring practices. What would you say was different that Netflix did that most companies don't do, that very slowly over time the culture is eroded?
So they did a couple of things that I really appreciated. One of them, I remember when I was going through the interview process, I was so excited. Actually, I'm a nerd, but once I, got hired, I wanted to basically see behind the scenes how they were managing all of that. And basically, because they do this thing where you'll first get on a call, usually with, a recruiter, unless you've come through a recommendation or somebody else knows. So in my case, that had happened. So I had jumped on the phone first with the hiring manager, but then often from there, you will still have this call with the recruiter. Recruiter's leaning really heavy to understand your fit from a cultural perspective. But then you have 2 more rounds of interviews that are 30 minutes each with 4 people. So sort of back to back. And some people would be like, oh my gosh, that's overkill. But it kills me whenever I hear that, because like, you're about to settle into a job and it's your chance just as much as the company's to make sure this is the right fit. So the fact that they went through that number of interviews, but those interviews were really smart. Before you bring somebody in, what you're doing is you're creating this basically setup of, hey, Artin, when you interview, Sarah, I need you to please make sure that you're looking and understanding that she's the right technical fit for this role. Please find out X, Y, Z. Then next after that, I could be like, hey, Patrick, I need you to interview and make sure that Sarah is a strong cultural fit. And then look at it that way. Then, elsewhere, you might look at it and be like, okay, hey, Jessica, please make sure that when you're interviewing, Sarah, that you're looking at her project management capabilities and how well she's going to do there. So you're now getting people who are really focused in honing in on it, and they're going to come back, and then behind the scenes, they'll give a score around how well people do based on that. And they'll give their, yes, we think this would be great, or here's the hesitation, which is basically 4 is yes, 1 is no. And then 2 and 3, are what you would expect based on that. So by the time you got through that first round, what would happen is the manager would get these notes back that they could see. And then they would then set up the next round based on trying to make sure they kind of, worked through those particular items. And in some cases, if somebody said, look, I don't think this person's going to be very good at taking feedback. So what'll happen is the manager might even jump on and be like, how did you think it went? Or a recruiter, it depends. And then from there, they would say, okay, great. Well, when you go into the next one, kind of here's one note that came up. Somebody thought maybe, you spent a little bit of too much time name dropping. So maybe just be careful not to drop names so much in there. You go into the next one then with that note. And if you continue to drop names, well, then that might reinforce that, yeah, this person's not very good at taking the feedback. They continue to do that. Now, maybe that's not the best example, but the idea is making sure that you now go in after that person's got feedback, and for somebody to go in and literally test them, maybe say, let's give them some tough feedback in the meeting and let's see how they respond. Because feedback and a culture of feedback is so important in Netflix. And I think it should be important anywhere, because, you want that openness. It creates, believe it or not, safety, because that you can talk to somebody without feeling like you need to, be secretive about your comments and notes. But so through that process, basically, that to me was so critical, because by the time you got to the end, you had a lot of confidence, because I believe in, I think, the idea of, you want to hire slow, but fire fast. And that's really hard for a lot of companies, because you spend so much time, you're desperate sometimes to fill a role. So you almost want to hire fast. And that's what too many companies do. They hire fast and then they fire slow, because then usually HR and others get in the way of it because they're worried about the legality of it. And did you properly make sure that you have everything in writing and all the things you have to? Again, that's company dependent, definitely that way at Disney. Whereas Netflix, no, they were really quick at doing it, and helping you through that process, because the faster you could get the right person into that role, the better. So all of those things connected, I think, really were key. And then from there too, Netflix did a great job of ultimately it was the idea of, having stunning colleagues was the term they used, being surrounded by stunning colleagues. And the idea is if somebody didn't hit that standard, then there was what was called the keeper test, which going back to the fire fast, it was like, if this person right now got an offer from another company, would I fight to keep them? If so, great. They pass the keeper test.
That's clever.
Yeah. And if not, you should really consider whether or not they're right for the role. And some people might be like, that's harsh. Well, again, the culture and the people they were looking at and, what they were trying to accomplish, that was ultimately what it embraced. And I think it gave them a huge edge because the people who were there were often the best from other companies because they could recruit and bring them in because they also believed in paying them at the top of market. So there were a lot of things, and I'm just scratching the surface here, but it's like, as I mentioned before, like with, sure, there were the perks internally of like free food and some other things like that, and the nice buildings. And while I think that's great and it can make you feel good for a moment, I think more and more studies are showing that that's less important and valuable at companies than it is for people to, be hired, trusted, paid well, given the autonomy to accomplish what they want to accomplish. So,
yeah. When we were talking about the interview process of, hey, so-and-so focus on this, are these people trained on how to actually engage in that interview process?
What I generally ran into there is I never had anybody who I didn't feel confident based on their notes and based on what they came back with. I would actually say, did Netflix have a specific training they put people through for the interview process? No. Nor did Disney. And that's actually a big thing you and I talked about in the past and thought about trying to start up a solution, around that, because most people aren't ever really trained on how to hire. But the big difference here at Netflix that was valuable is the set of questions when you're like, this is what you're shaken down for in this meeting, which at Disney, as we know, oftentimes when there were these interviews, there often wasn't that. People just kind of showed up to it and it's like, oh, wait, hold on here.
It was like a impulse for the moment. What do I ask? What do I ask type of scenario.
Yeah, no, exactly it. And almost like you're being led with, oh, I hope this is the right person instead of let's find out if this is the right person. So I think that's an important, difference, even though I do think people can benefit from having more training and hiring. I think if somebody just takes 15 minutes in advance of an interview and really breaks out and says, I need to know this at minimum to know that this person is right for this role. And then if after that interview, they also shouldn't feel uncomfortable if they're like, I'm still on the fence, to then look to a colleague and say, I need some help. I like them, but these are some concerns I have. Would you mind seeing what responses you get around those and work to make sure you find that right candidate? It's what's best for you, the team, and that person ultimately, because you don't want to bring in a person that you have to make a change later because they weren't the right fit for the company.
Yeah. I have heard, I've never experienced it myself, but I have heard that, some of the big tech companies, Amazon, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, kind of follow a similar thing as you described at Netflix, which is probably why they were all considered FANG or grouped together. But it seems like they all did a good job of hiring top talent because they knew how important it was to push initiatives and the company forward.
It was their edge. I was going to say, although one thing that people have recently said is some of them started hogging it all because now they were forced. It's like there were people that were hired there that, probably very talented, but some of them have literally said, they had no work for me to actually, do, but that's another, topic. Let me say one more thing there, because you mentioned hiring. And onboarding often goes hand in hand. So one thing I just want to mention with that too is that the onboarding process can be a real big turnoff for team members. By the way, the interview process can be too. I remember getting in an argument with somebody at Disney once because I didn't think that the way that they were interacting in front of this new potential hire, not that they should hide anything, but I just thought that it was like really unprofessional. And I'm like, you just gave this person a taste of the department that isn't normally taking place here, but it looks like it is based on what you just did. But I think the onboarding in general, once somebody does join up, it's really important that there's a clear plan for it. And it's like, okay, great. Whether you pair somebody with, this is going to be your buddy. You have any questions? So-and-so's got you. They're one of our strongest employees here, whatever you want to say. They're very well connected. They're going to help you with anything you need. And by the way, we're also scheduling, these are all the other people that you want to meet with. And when you go in, this is your goal as you come out of that. And these are the other things that you really want to accomplish over the course of your first 90 days. Like when I'm coaching clients, I literally have a 90-day plan where I try to walk them through some of this stuff because it's so important. And oftentimes the employer doesn't provide that. But really, if an employer can, then that team member is going to come out from those 90 days feeling good, feeling part of the culture, make sure they're engaged in some of the right meetings so that they could be like, oh, I get it. I get what this culture stands for. And make sure that they're, people don't like using the term family, so I won't say part of the family, but part of the team, and at least making sure that they also had some wins and successes and really understand what they're accountable and responsible for. And that ties back to the vision piece of it too.
Yeah, and that basically goes to what I was going to talk about, where besides, leadership and the hiring and onboarding process, it's the communication and hopefully transparency to be part of that. And then engagement, like to really build and sustain a good culture, you need those two in place. Because if the employees aren't engaged, they're going to leave, or they're just going to be, what's the phrase? Quiet quitter, or what? Like if you're not engaged, you're going to be a quiet quitter because you're just doing the bare minimum to move on.
No, absolutely right.
Yeah. And then I also think that recognition and rewards is an important part of the culture, but it's very different company by company. And the bigger the company, the more difficult, just mid-management and, executives have tools in their pocket to do. But you have to find ways to recognize them. And then the last one, I would say that my culture definitely will be big on learning and development. And we would make sure to do things that get people to feel like they're learning and growing personally and in their life. And it's just not a one-way street of push to grow the company. Like it should be both ways, like grow the company, but grow the individual too. I remember at Disney, when we were part of the same organization, for your team, you had kicked off a few initiatives for learning and development. Do you remember what those were?
There are a couple different things we did. One of them was we did these TED Talks where, the individual would basically pick one of their favorite TED Talks. We were going to put the full pressure on them. And then we'd all come together because we had the benefit then that, we also oversaw the teams who we had the theater underneath our, portfolio, which meant we could book those up and we could basically put a TED Talk on, a big screen, if you will. And we'd invite people. In fact, we started expanding that to other groups eventually, which was also a great way to kind of share and create that camaraderie. But with that, they would share the TED Talk, and then the person would share what it meant to them afterwards, and we start a conversation around it. So that was like one example that I thought was pretty successful. And it was nice when, some people are like, would come up and ask, hey, could I do, the next one? I have one I'd really like to do. So that's one example. I don't know if you wanted to share one that you put in place yourself, but.
I know I did this in the past, but I think it expanded. I don't know where, but there was a book club too. We had a book club, and I think at some point we combined them to be one like giant book club. And it was all in the spirit of learning and growing. And then there was also the being a TED Talk speaker yourself, where you just got up in front of your peers and talked about something. And the whole goal was to get people comfortable giving presentations. Those are a few I can remember. But again, going back to, it was a focus of ours. Like we put time and effort into this. We worked late. We put in time on the weekends to actually come up with, what should we do and how do we execute on it? And that's the key. You have to believe in it and then put time into it.
Yeah. And I think for us putting that time in, say that we can say there, a couple of reasons for that. Anybody who's thinking, wait, what? It's like, well, look, for us, we cared. We cared about the team. It was really important for us. So when we say we put in weekends, it's like, because in some ways for us, this was like, I don't want to say a passion or like, but it's like, it was, we wanted that. That was so important to us that it was something that, it starts to be a fine line between whether or not that's work or whether or not that's just purpose or our, what we want to do.
Whenever I was thinking about cultural initiatives, it never felt like work for me.
That's exactly it. And by the way, I think that's a key attribute of a strong leader and the type of leaders who should be enrolled, where they just look at that and they're like, well, yeah, of course, this is what I'm going to do. And this is important for me because, again, I'm creating this team. It's like a coach, of a sport or whatever it is. They want to bring it together. They want to do.
I just remembered a funny thing we did. I was trying to think about team building exercises. And, when you Google, you're going to get a bunch of stuff. And some of them just felt like, come on. And some of them are like, that's not even feasible to do. So I was trying to figure out what can we do that's fun, that's unique. And I remember I came up with this idea. I told everybody in the team, I don't know, 45, 50 people. I told them block 90 minutes. We're all meeting in this specific area. You're going to be put into teams of 4, but I'm not going to tell you what you're going to do until that day. So then that day comes and I pull up close to that area with a van. And they're all looking at me like, what are you doing? I open the door and there is 25 Ikea boxes in the van. They're like, what is this? I'm like, that's our team building exercise. You guys as a team are going to put together this Ikea furniture and then put it back in the box so then I can return it. Whoever does it the fastest is the best team and they're going to get a prize. It was one of the most memorable 90 minutes that I can remember. It was so fun watching people trying to put this IKEA furniture together and then put it back so I can return it. It was great.
Hilarious. That's messed up. When you when you mention that too. So there's a term called the IKEA effect that people use, which is the idea that when people build something, they take more ownership of it. And hence so many people here, because, prior to IKEA, granted, you had people, crafts, men and women who would put together maybe this stuff and build it on their own at home. But like in this case, it's like IKEA's literally made it to that you put together your own furniture. So you're doing some of the work, but somehow in the end, you feel more pride in it because you're like, I built that. Well, I'm going to tie that back to culture because this is something else that we did as well at Disney. And again, because we mentioned creating cultures and then subcultures, because unfortunately, like I say, sometimes you have to create those subcultures, or at least I felt that way, because you're trying to create a more engaging and empowering department for the team. And if you try to just change the rest of the company, good luck with that. But you can sometimes do that. And I think it's really important for leaders to look at that and see how they do it. And it's back to the ownership thing. They may not have been the founder, but it doesn't mean they can't still operate it to this degree in a way that fits well with them. And then they hire based on, some of those values as well.
I felt like the founder of, and I mean, even today, whether it's my own company or I'm working within a company, I feel like the founder of my little area, little bigger. Like that's just how I approach it.
And if you don't as a leader, then I think that speaks of either one of two things. One, maybe you're not the right fit as the leader, or two, and I'd say it may be more likely this, it could be that you're in a organization that's not letting you be you in the way that you're going to lead and manage. And if that's the case too, then it might be the right time to get out of there. But one thing I want to finish on the IKEA effect piece of it is that when we set up the subculture within Disney, we first pulled the team because look, we're not trying to recreate who we are, but there were no core values. Like Disney, I couldn't name any core values. By the way, that's one thing Netflix was fantastic about. And while I ain't mentioned this before, like if anybody goes and visits Netflix, culture page, you'll see all their core values. Well, often those core values were exactly what we'd say to people. Please interview around curiosity or communication, pick the core value, impact at one point, around there. And then that's what people honed in on. But so what we did at the time at Disney is we asked the team, hey, what does it mean for you to be part of this department division? And we started seeing this and we started seeing some trends and we tried to embrace those trends. But then from there, we actually worked with the team members to then help actually craft and say, okay, if this is what it is, now let's come up with some of our own visuals as a way to support that. And we really had the team help to shape that. And obviously we as leaders still work together and said, is this what we believe in? Do we want to tweak any of these because the team feels this, but we actually want to go this direction? But the key there once more is by making sure they were part of building it and had a voice in it. That's, I also think, another key piece about building a successful team and culture. And something once more that Netflix did really well that I think Disney could learn from is the transparency side of it, which you mentioned earlier. But when you're transparent and you're not keeping as much from the team, they trust you a lot more as well.
Yeah. Speaking of building and you own it, another example was after one of the reorgs where my team grew and there was like several teams, I wanted them to kind of act as one team and not be like several teams. One of the initiatives that I kicked off was let's rewrite what is our values? Like, what are we even here for? Why does Disney need us? And instead of me writing it, the team contributed to writing it. And then I held a design competition to put those core values into a poster. and then everybody designed posters, and then eventually one got the winner of it, and then that got converted into an animated logo. But just make the story short, because they built it, they actually it was easier to stand behind it and for them to actually embody those values that they wrote. It wasn't me. It was them actually writing it with my guidance and feedback. But that really helps. If you're building from scratch, if you can get the team engaged and helping you build those cultural values, you'll have a higher chance of actually sustaining it.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think, with that too, a company needs to make sure that they have the regular meetings and conversations around these topics in the same way that they would around the financial growth of the business or around how well their marketing is doing, et cetera. And that was another thing that we had implemented. We had what was called the culture club, and a core set of individuals met around that, and then another individual within that group ultimately then also had some regular meetings with another sort of subset made up of different individuals from each of the sub departments here. That way we could engage the 150 or so people that were part of this overall group. And it was so important because we would go through and we would look at a set of things that we wanted to make sure we were answering. And what are the upcoming activities? We'd have a monthly birthday thing. What else do we want to celebrate? Anything else that's there as we pull everybody, together for that? What are some other key things around recognition? Heck, sometimes for me, it was making sure that we would just put things on the radar of some of the other executives in the group to make sure that they were celebrating the team around this, because the recognition rewards is also super important. But that has to happen, because if it doesn't happen, then unfortunately, again, it's an afterthought instead of one of the first thoughts that one has to be thinking about. And I think that's going back to leadership thing. Leadership needs to be thinking about the vision. They constantly need to be thinking about how they shape that culture as well. And I think that also comes down to these quarterly, I think is the right timing of it, of events, or when I say events, like goal setting, making sure, people understand. And something that I actually wish I would have done a little bit better, and this is sometimes that thing that happens when you're trying to find the balance between implementing key things, when sometimes the vision and clarity of the overall division you're in is more difficult. But just really making sure people are clear in this quarter, this is what we want to accomplish. And in fact, if it's around a number or a metric, if your goal is to take improve upon that, and then let the team go on it and have them have their core sort of focuses or rocks is what sometimes referred to be able to accomplish, because then that helps the team members each quarter look at it, reflect, see what they've done, and then start setting their own goals accordingly as well.
Yeah. The other kind of tip I wanted to give was, if you're a founder and you're thinking about starting your own company, what is extremely valuable is the way that the company behaves and thinks and what it wants to be for the public is part of your brand. Because for whatever reason, that just flows into everybody. So the examples I can give is, and again, this is all external because who knows what the inside of the companies look like. But if I think about Apple and kind of think different, it just feels like anytime I encountered anybody at Apple, they were that. They really took that to heart. I haven't encountered a lot of Nike employees, but it just feels like everybody is just do it. It just feels like all the employees will probably be about just do it. So I think that branding aspect of it helps make a point and drive forward your cultural, whatever you're trying to do with your culture.
I think it's a great point. And then it's, there's a great book on the topic called Made to Stick. And it just talks about how you make these things sort of memorable. And I think something like that's super powerful, because if the team can easily remember it and get behind it, it's a lot easier. Because otherwise, if you've got to remember some long thing or whatever it is, forget about it. Nobody is. But those are certain key things. What's also great about those, though, is they're embodied both internally and externally, because they've created it so that that's how their people outside also feel, the customers.
Oh yeah, that's how you create brand loyalty.
Exactly. What happens, with that then is when it comes to hiring, it's a lot easier because people want to hire. I mean, look at Disney saw it as, look, people want to work here often because of the brand, and they knew they could be a little less competitive on pay. because people were really excited to, work there. This company, again, I referenced around the smaller plumbing company. Well, for them, they were a sought after company, and they had a lot of people who, and they do, today, who want to work there because of what they're putting out there on social media, because they've decided to focus on that as a presence, different than most plumbing companies, but it gives them an edge in recruiting. So yeah, that's so key. If you could create a culture that's renowned for, and I think that's why everybody really wants to do it. I mean, it can be hard to find team members and right team members, but if you create a culture that has the right people seeking you, then that's such a key important thing to be able to do.
Wow. That's called a competitive advantage.
100%. 100%.
Yes. So you mentioned one book, but to slowly wrap this episode up, what are some other books you think listeners and audience should pick up?
I think resources in general around this. Actually, I'm going to cheat. All right, there's one more thing I want to touch on before I hit those. One of those too is because I just got to touch on performance reviews, because a lot of companies do that wrong as well. Like some of them have moved to the idea of doing more regular feedback sessions and having that. And again, feedback is so critical to any healthy culture. But if too many companies at the end of the year are like, all right, go ahead, write up your review now on the individual. And oftentimes bosses might be disconnected. Oftentimes it's an afterthought until the end of the year when even team members do it. And
it's usually a chore. People feel like it's a burden and it's a chore, but they just do it to get it out of the way rather than actually believing that this is something valuable, which goes back to the culture. Is if culturally this is not, the feedback and session is not elevated to be something important from the leadership perspective, everybody's going to look at it as just something else to do. It's like those annoying internal videos you have to watch, like on sexual harassment or anything. Like it just feels like it's one of those. Let's just get it over with.
No, that's exactly that. And again, I think, companies don't acknowledge it, but that's literally, feeding the impression everybody has of the culture then. And, oh, okay, they're going to waste my time now and make me go through this, even though they probably already have their mind made up and they may not need this thing. And again, for me, optimally, going back to it before, I would say if people are really going to do something like that, well, let it be more driven by the employee to this degree, by setting up the right culture where that person every quarter is setting their own goals of what they want to do. Sure, give your, hey, I think those are great goals, or hey, what about something around this? We also want to do this. How do you think we could do that? Well, we could do X, Y, Z. Great. Let's, go ahead and add that. And, I love this. And, we'll see you at the quarter when we do our updates for the team, and everybody knows, because that's a way that we create transparency, is by sharing that. Like, I think something like that's super powerful. And what I try to do with my team, who knows, this could be something now that they're like, oh yeah, thanks for that, Michael. No, but I would, as we went into goals each year, while the company was trying to figure out what they want to do around this, well, my team, I usually look for them to deliver these regular sort of just updates around monthly wows or weekly wins. And we got a lot of traction out of that to help them toot their own, horn, make sure people were aware of the things they were accomplishing. And they were all things that actually helped me land my team a lot of, promotions and raises on a whole larger than a lot of the rest of the organization, and put us in a place where we were pretty much weren't impacted by any of the, every other year, reorgs and layoffs that happened, because we were, in control and thinking ahead of these sort of things. But one of the things I asked the team to do is we would go through this exercise to look at their aspirations. So rather than just look at, the end of year, how did I do? We would actually set up what do we want to accomplish in a year? And I would ask them to actually say, well, here's what I want to accomplish by the end of the year. Here are the things I'm trying to set out for. And I asked them, I said, don't just include work, outside of work too. And then my goal was, great, let's think about that entirety thing here, because I'm, and maybe some people won't like this, but for me, I'm like, I don't, internal, external, I care about both. I care about you as an individual. And let's then try to figure out and see how we can help you achieve that. And by the way, sometimes it works out really well anyway for the company, because you find that this person's like, well, eventually, or I want to start a business, or I want to do this side hustle, I want to do that. It's like, great, you need to get more, financial experience or more leadership experience. So in this next quarter or this next year, how can we do that? And how can we get you that? Or if their goal is, I want to get promoted or get a bigger raise, it's like, okay, great. Then here's the key things we have to think about when it comes to you and how you're adding value. Those conversations, then let them set goals that meant something to them, instead of just reacting at the end of the year and trying to check a box and saying what they had.
And that approach, and I did, similar things, it just shows that you care. And genuinely, you have to genuinely care to do that. It can't be a front, and you can't just be going through the motion. But if you genuinely care and you do that, it comes across. And that's why I think both of us had people that were knocking on our door saying, can we join your team? Can we join your team? Because there was this positive press that would go out. The other thing that I did at the startup that I think would be great for big corporations to adopt is, why should reviews be one way? Like I always feel like, well, if a manager is reviewing an individual contributor, why shouldn't the individual computer review the manager? Like it should be both ways.
Yeah. So, and I think a lot of companies, especially tech, are doing that more. At Netflix, it was basically 360s, and we would do those at least once a year, but the idea was feedbacks all the time. And it would go both ways. And like for me there as a leader, and I did this at Disney too, I would say to the team, hey, any feedback for me, anything I could do. Now, you could tell that there was a less comfort doing that at a place like Disney. At Netflix, sometimes it happens so much that you're like, oh my gosh, like, because everybody then you have to start separating, okay, which of these things should I really consider here? Because some of them might be a personal preference, and some of them may be themes you start to see. And that's where the 360s they did were valuable. But I agree, because look, nobody know. I learned so much from my team. It's like they may not, at times they were my coach, around things.
Sometimes they call you out on your blind spots. You're like, thank you. I had no idea.
And you have to, if you don't have people around you like that, then eventually, I think it puts you in a jam and you run into, some challenges later. And by the way, too, as I say that, it's like, I just want to highlight these two because, I mentioned some different things that were really solid at, Netflix, but every culture has its own things too. And one thing I will mention is like, Netflix, there was this divide between, how product operated and studio operated. You had a lot of people coming in with the mentality of studios, which is very different from product. And I would say very different from how Reed wanted things to operate. And that created this sort of challenge there internally. And, in the future, we could talk about, some of the pros and cons to the way that Netflix operates. And they are having to go through their own evolution now as they mature as a company, because you could also act a bit different when you're in the sort of startup phase than you can when you're in a mature phase. And that's a big difference between our working at, Disney as an example, that's in a very mature phase versus other companies that we've worked for. But I want to go back to your question about resources real quick then. So wrap us up. But
yeah, let's wrap us up with some books and maybe movies that the audience should watch and read.
Sounds good. That's always fun. Okay. So Delivering Happiness, which is the story of Zappos and culture. That was the one you and I actually read and really got us excited about how we could implement these unique cultures. So I would highly recommend that one. The Culture Map by Erin Meyer is also a great book. She actually also co-authored No Rules Rules, which is a book on Netflix culture, which is also worth a read. But Culture Map is really interesting because there's actually an online test you can do too, but it has you start looking at culture, not just culture in a business, but culture around different parts of the world, because that influences how they look at business. And it's just fascinating when you start thinking about how, as an example, like somebody from Amsterdam might be somebody who is a lot more straight and to the point. Whereas maybe around the US, they might beat around it a little bit more. And in, Japan is another example. There's certain things about how they, operate as a culture. And in fact, sometimes titles matter a lot there, or there's different, approaches there. And in all these cultures, men, women, the way that looks. So anyway, that one's fascinating. I think read the culture deck from both, and by this, it's basically what's on the website. Just search Netflix culture. Netflix, when you just see a really good breakout of what everybody sees there and what so much of the interview process then gets built around. Bridgewater has a great culture deck as well. And then Ray Dalio has a TED talk about, setting up a company with innovation. Any other books that I didn't mention? I know you went through some too.
Some leadership books also do a good job of either directly talking on culture or indirectly referencing culture. I can't think of them off the top of my head, but we'll link to all these books in the description section of this episode, just so it's easy for people to reference.
Cool. On that, actually, too, just because you referenced that, there's a book called Traction, Get a Grip on Your Business, which,
yes, that's one of them, actually, I was thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, that's a solid one. And again, it does talk about, the vision and the goal setting, which I think is super critical.
Yeah. And the other one I was thinking about, and I might be getting the title wrong, but it's like the $1 billion coach or the $1 trillion coach. That one was great because it talked about culture a lot and how he used the sports culture in the tech world. And that was pretty impressive.
That's Bill Campbell, $1 trillion coach, and it's because he helped, Google, Apple, Intuit, like he was a guy. So that's why they say $1 trillion, because he, helped amass that amount of value through his coaching of some of these teams. Yeah,
Yeah. But there's more. We'll definitely link these out. How about movies? Since we're movie guys, let's name a couple movies.
Yeah. So I think, one of them that is an example of, toxic culture. In fact, funny enough, I think a lot of movies end up being more about toxic culture, but sometimes it's now, what do people do despite being in these toxic cultures? So I think that's where this list might hit. Wall Street, obviously greed and the way that looks and how you, approach happy at Wall Street 1 or Wall Street, 2. I think that's an example. Wolf of Wall Street, speaking of Wall Street, is another one. I mean, you look at that, it's pretty much everything that could go wrong in a culture. And you're like, how did that ever exist? And while you look at it, you're like, well, that looked like a lot of fun. You're also like, that looked like chaos. And how was any of that possible? One of my favorites of recent was actually The Big Short.
Oh, great movie.
Yeah. And what's awesome about that one, had to do with the 2008 financial collapse is like, it's a perfect look at what happens when cultures aren't open to sort of this feedback and overriding and really doing what's right sometimes, because they were so driven by like the financial incentives and people blinding themselves to what was right and wrong. And you just see that all over in that one. So that's incredible. Office Space being another one that, is kind of a meme around anything with, questionable toxic culture. And of course, one we could say is more of a favorite is good old Jerry Maguire, because in that case, it's like, okay, but he stands up for what he believes in. And he ends up at least going out and it works out well for him as he follows, what was right for him. So any other add to that?
I can't think of any off the top of my head, but you're right. It's, just the nature of storytelling, because you have to put your main character into this very undesirable situation and watch them succeed out of it. So just by nature of storytelling, it's always a bad situation or the bad culture the person is in.
But by the way, if we tie that back though to the opening stat that you'd mentioned about 82% of professionals having worked for a company where they disliked it, well, maybe those movies aren't completely far off. But the key here is hopefully with some of the things that we were talking about in here, it's like I think a lot of people can do a better job of implementing. They can create their subcultures if that's what they need to do. Or they can put more emphasis as a leader to really make sure that they reinforce that, especially as they enter the C-suites and others, to really make sure they understand how much they can help, not only the company's performance, but the individual performance and the individual's happiness is really what a lot of it ends up tying back to, which is why I loved Zappos delivering happiness, because it, spoke on it on so many levels of both the customer as well as the individual employee to work as well.
The other one that just came to mind is Moneyball, because that, changed the culture of baseball. And some actually say it ruined baseball, because it's so data driven now that the excitement has been sucked out of it. You can argue that, other reasons for it, but, I think they should just bring steroids back because it made baseball more fun with steroids.
There you go. That finds the perfect exit point about what we're recommending.
Anyways, steroids made baseball fun. That was the culture. Speaking of culture, the culture of Major League Baseball in the 90s was steroid culture. And because it started being okay, all of a sudden players looked at each other and said, well, he's doing it, I'm going to do it too. It's okay. And it slowly became this big thing, which made baseball fun for fans. But obviously it also was not good for the game.
Exactly. I think wrestling maybe fits into that one too. Yeah.
Well, is that a sport or is that just people acting?
That's fair. That's fair. Well, you'll have to ask your friend Artine, what his thoughts are on that, since he's more of a follower than we are.
Yeah.
It's the same question somebody may argue with golf. Now, somebody listening right now is like, "How dare you?" But what other sport do you get a drink when you're playing? Just saying. Does that disqualify it from?
Professionals don't do that, but yeah, as amateurs, because it's so hard to hit that damn ball straight, you need a drink. You need a drink. Otherwise, it just drives you crazy. Anyways, to wrap this up, thanks for listening again. If you have any suggestions on future episodes, any comments, please drop them below, or subscribe on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube. And we'll see you in the next one. Thank you.
Thank you.